Dr. Serena Hale stepped out of a classified security briefing into a gray Washington afternoon, the kind of low cloud cover that made the whole city feel as though it were holding its breath. She had spent the morning inside a windowless room discussing threats most citizens would never learn about, and now all she wanted was a few quiet minutes with a cup of coffee before returning to a schedule that would not let up until late. She had left her security detail behind at headquarters, a decision she made more often than her staff liked, because there were mornings when the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation simply wanted to exist as a private citizen for a little while. She got behind the wheel of her own car, a Rolls-Royce Phantom finished in obsidian black, a gift to herself after 2 decades of work that had cost her more sleep than she cared to count, and drove herself toward a small coffee shop near Georgetown that she visited whenever her calendar allowed it. Serena had built a career on being underestimated long before she ever sat behind the wheel of a car worth more than most houses in the neighborhoods where she had grown up. She had come up through a public high school in a city where opportunity was rationed carefully. Along lines nobody dared say out loud, had worked twice as many hours as her classmates to earn a scholarship to law school, and had spent her first decade as a federal prosecutor being asked more times than she could count whether she was in the right courtroom. She had learned to let the question pass without remark, to let her results speak instead of her voice, and by the time she was appointed to lead the bureau, few people who had watched her rise were surprised, though plenty who had never met her still struggled to picture the woman behind the title. She parked legally, fed the meter, checked the mirrors out of old habit, and walked inside wearing a plain wool coat with no insignia, no badge visible, nothing to suggest she was anyone other than a well-dressed woman getting her afternoon coffee. The barista knew her only as Serena, a regular who tipped well and never made a scene. She ordered a black coffee, found a seat near the window, and had barely taken her first sip when her phone rang with a call she could not ignore. National security business did not wait for coffee to cool, and what should have been brief stretched longer. When she finally stepped back outside, coffee forgotten on the table behind her, she stopped cold at what she saw happening to her car. A boy police tow truck had backed up against the front of her Phantom, thick steel cables already looped beneath the frame, and 2 patrol cars sat angled behind it with their lights spinning lazily against the gray afternoon. A small crowd of pedestrians had gathered on the sidewalk, phones already rising to capture whatever spectacle was unfolding. Serena crossed the street quickly, her low heels clicking against the pavement, her voice steady even as her pulse quickened. "That is my vehicle," she said, coming to a stop a few feet from the nearest officer. "Please stop what you are doing." The officer, a broad-shouldered man, barely looked at her. "Step back, ma'am," he said, waving a hand as though she were an inconvenience rather than the owner of hundreds of thousands of dollars of steel and craftsmanship currently being hooked to a winch. Serena did not step back. She repeated herself, calmer this time, the same tone she used in rooms full of generals and senators, the tone that had ended arguments far more dangerous than this one. "I am telling you clearly that car belongs to me. I can show you registration, insurance, and identification if you will simply give me a moment." A younger officer near the truck laughed under his breath, the kind of laugh meant to be heard. "Sure it is," he said, not even bothering to hide his amusement. "Nobody around here owns a car like that outright, and definitely not somebody who looks like you." His partner chuckled along with him, and the sound rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. A few of them shook their heads at the officer's remark. Most of them simply watched, phones still raised, waiting to see what would happen next. A delivery driver unloading boxes from a nearby van paused mid-stride, box balanced against his hip, and simply stared, unable to decide whether to keep working or intervene. Elderly woman walking a small terrier stopped at the corner and tightened the leash instinctively, the way people do when they sense something in the air has shifted from ordinary to uncomfortable. Serena recognized the pattern immediately because she had lived inside it for most of her adult life. It was never one single moment that told a person they were being dismissed because of how they looked. It was the accumulation of small signals, the sideways glance, the slight change in tone, the assumption offered so casually that the person making it never even registered it as an assumption at all. She had felt it in courtrooms early in her career when opposing counsel addressed her as though she were the court reporter. She had felt it in her first years at the bureau when new agents mistook her for administrative staff before learning her title. She had long since stopped expecting the feeling to disappear entirely, but she had also long since learned exactly how to hold her composure inside it. Because composure, she had discovered, was the sharpest tool available to her in moments like this one. Serena felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came from being underestimated, a feeling she had carried since law school, since her first years as a federal prosecutor, since every room she had ever walked into where someone assumed the credentials belonged to anyone but her. She had learned long ago that anger rarely won these moments. Patience did. She had watched too many colleagues over the years lose an argument they were technically right about simply because frustration crept into their voice at the wrong second, handing the other side an excuse to dismiss the substance of what they were saying in favor of remarking on their tone instead. She refused to give anyone that excuse today. She took a slow breath and reached for her wallet. "Before I even ask you to look at anything," she said, "I want you to understand that this vehicle is registered, insured, and parked legally. There is no reason for it to be towed." The winch groaned to life. The cable pulled taut. The tow truck driver, following instructions from the officers rather than any protocol, as Serena recognized, began easing the truck forward, and the front wheels of the Phantom lifted slowly off the asphalt. Serena's voice sharpened, though it never rose. "Stop the truck," she said. "Now." Nobody stopped the truck. The lieutenant in charge introduced himself only because Serena demanded a name, and even then he gave it with obvious irritation, as though her request were an insult to his authority. Lieutenant Rylan Crowe had the build of a man who had played football in another decade and never quite let go of the swagger that came with it. He walked toward Serena with his thumbs hooked into his belt, chin tilted slightly upward, the posture of someone who had never once in his career been forced to explain himself to a person who looked like her. "We got a report that this vehicle matched the profile of a stolen luxury car ring operating out of Maryland," he said, though he offered no paperwork, no case number, nothing beyond his own assertion. "Until we clear that up, the car is coming with us." Serena asked calmly to see the report. Crowe waved the request away. She asked for a supervisor's name and badge number. He gave a fake laugh instead. She asked whether any of them had run the vehicle identification number before deciding to destroy a car worth more than most of their annual salaries combined. Nobody answered. A woman standing nearby with a shopping bag in one hand and a phone in the other murmured to her friend that this did not look right, that the officers had not even attempted to verify anything before hooking up the cables. A man on the opposite corner had his phone raised, recording steadily, catching every word without any of them noticing or caring. "You know what this looks like," Serena said quietly, more for the crowd than for Crowe. "It looks like you decided the car was stolen the moment you saw who was standing next to it." Crowe's jaw tightened. "Watch yourself," he said. "You're close to obstruction." A second officer, a stocky man with a shaved head who had been silent until then, stepped closer and added his own remark, apparently under the impression that reinforcement would strengthen Crowe's position rather than expose it further. "We see this scam every other month," he said, addressing the crowd more than Serena herself. Somebody borrows a car or leases it under somebody else's name, then acts offended when we start asking questions. It never fails. Serena turned toward him with the same level gaze she had used on Crow. "Ask your questions properly, then," she said. "Pull the registration. Run the plate through your own system. I will stand here and wait exactly as long as it takes for you to do your job correctly." Neither officer moved to do so. Instead, the tow truck driver, taking his cues from the uniforms rather than the woman standing in front of him with a perfectly reasonable request, climbed back into his cab and prepared to finish what he had started. Serena did not raise her voice. She did not reach for a badge she was choosing, for reasons she alone understood, not to reveal. She simply repeated her request for a supervisor, for documentation, for anything resembling due process, and was met with the same wall of dismissal that had followed her through every uniformed room she had ever entered before earning the right to command hundreds of thousands of agents. The winch cable, still taut from the earlier attempt, shifted with a violent jerk as the truck driver repositioned the angle. Metal groaned against metal. The front bumper of the Phantom, hand-finished and imported at extraordinary cost, cracked audibly and dropped half loose onto the pavement, dangling by a single bolt. A gasp rose from the crowd. Even Crow flinched, just slightly, before covering it with a shrug. "Not my problem if it's an old car falling apart," he muttered, though the Phantom was nearly new and gleaming until moments earlier. By the time the truck had dragged the car forward another few feet, the undercarriage scraping hard against the asphalt with a sound like a wound being opened, the alloy wheels had begun to buckle under the strain of an angle they were never designed to hold. One of the custom rims cracked clean through, sending a spray of sparks skittering across the street. The laser headlamp housing, a technology so precise it had taken engineers years to perfect, shattered against the curb. Serena stood at the edge of the sidewalk, arms folded, watching in silence as hundreds of thousands of dollars of craftsmanship disintegrated in front of her. A stranger nearby, an older man who had been watching the entire episode unfold, finally stepped close enough to speak to her directly. "Why aren't you stopping this?" he asked. "Why aren't you screaming at them, calling a lawyer? Anything?" Serena kept her eyes on the wreckage. "Because I want to see exactly how far they are willing to go," she said quietly. "Every second they continue, they are building the case against themselves far better than I ever could." The man studied her for a moment, unsure whether he was looking at extraordinary composure or simple shock, and said nothing more. A woman near the coffee shop entrance, phone held low but still recording, whispered to the person beside her that she had never seen anyone stay so still while watching something so expensive get destroyed. Her companion murmured back that maybe the car meant nothing to the woman at all, though anyone looking closely enough might have noticed the tightness around Serena's jaw, the way her fingers pressed briefly into her palm before releasing again. Small signs of a composure being maintained through effort rather than indifference. The paint, hand applied over. Dozens of hours by artisans who took pride in a finish deep enough to reflect the sky like still water, had been gouged along one entire flank where the vehicle scraped against a parked delivery truck during the tow's clumsy maneuvering. The rear quarter panel folded inward with a low metallic groan. What had been, less than half an hour earlier, one of the most beautiful automobiles in the city, was now a wounded, twisted shell being dragged sideways down a public street while uniformed officers stood by congratulating themselves on a job well done. Crow noticed the growing crowd, the raised phones, the murmurs of disapproval spreading through the onlookers like a current, and rather than pause to reconsider, he doubled down, raising his voice to project authority he no longer fully possessed. "This is what happens when people try to run scams with fancy foreign cars," he announced to no one in particular, and everyone in particular. "We see this all the time. Serena said nothing. She simply reached into her coat pocket, retrieved her phone, and stepped a few feet away from the chaos. The truck driver, apparently unsatisfied that the vehicle was sufficiently disabled, called out that the doors needed to be checked for contraband before the tow could proceed to impound. Crow agreed immediately, and within moments 2 officers approached the driver's side door with a rescue hammer normally reserved for extracting accident victims from crushed wreckage. Serena turned in time to see the hammer arc downward. "Stop," she said, and for the first time real urgency entered her voice. "You do not have a warrant. You do not have probable cause. Breaking that window is a decision you will regret." The glass shattered anyway, raining safety fragments across the leather seats inside. Seats that had been stitched by hand to match a shade of cream Serena had chosen herself during a factory visit years earlier. An officer reached inside, unlocked the door from within, and began rifling through the glove compartment without gloves, without a witness present to document the search, without any of the procedural safeguards that existed precisely to prevent moments like this one. "No warrant," Serena said again, quieter now, almost to herself, though she made certain her tone carried to the man recording from across the street. "No warrant, no consent, no documented probable cause. Every single one of you is now personally exposed." The officer inside the car pulled out a leather portfolio from the glove compartment, flipping through it carelessly, scattering several documents onto the passenger seat amid the broken glass. He found the vehicle's registration and insurance card within seconds, both bearing Serena's full legal name in plain black print. Yet he barely glanced at either before tossing them back into the pile and continuing to search beneath the seats as though the paperwork sitting directly in front of him meant nothing at all. A second officer opened the trunk without asking, rifling through a garment bag that held a spare blazer Serena kept for late meetings, running his hands along the lining as though expecting to find something incriminating hidden inside the seams. Crow sneered. "You want to file a complaint, lady? Go ahead and file it. Nobody's going to care." Serena looked at him for a long moment, longer than felt comfortable. The kind of look that made even confident men shift their weight from one foot to the other. "I need your full name," she said. "All of you. Every badge number on this street." A ripple of laughter passed among the officers. One of them, younger than the rest, called out that she could find their names painted on the side of the impound lot when she came to bail her stolen car out of custody. Serena did not argue further. She turned, walked calmly to the curb, out of earshot of the chaos behind her, and lifted her phone to her ear. The call lasted only a brief moment. No greeting, no explanation, just 2 words spoken low and precise into the receiver, words that meant nothing to anyone who might have overheard them and everything to the person on the other end of the line. "Protocol Raven," she said, and ended the call before a reply could even form. Moments later, on the 9th floor of a building. Most residents of Washington had never set foot inside. An operations desk lit up with an alert that had not been triggered in years. A junior analyst read the notification twice to make certain she understood it correctly before picking up a secure line and speaking 4 words that set an entire chain of command into motion. "Director Hale, Code Raven, confirmed." Within the Bureau's headquarters, doors that were normally opened only by badge and retina scans swung wide as senior agents abandoned meetings, briefings, and lunch breaks alike. A special agent in charge who had been mid-sentence in a budget review simply stood up, apologized once, and walked out without further explanation. Nobody in that room asked where he was going. Nobody needed to. Back on the street outside the coffee shop, Crow and his officers continued their work, entirely unaware that somewhere across the city, gears were already turning. That would end their afternoon in a way none of them could yet imagine. The tow truck driver secured the last strap around what remained of the Phantom's frame. An officer laughed at something his partner said. The crowd on the sidewalk had grown larger, phones still recording, capturing every careless word. Then, faintly at first, a new sound rose over the city noise, a low mechanical thrum, distant but growing louder with each passing second. The unmistakable rhythm of rotor blades cutting through low cloud cover. The sound multiplied. What had been one distant thrum became 3 distinct aircraft. Black helicopters descending in careful formation toward a stretch of open avenue 2 blocks away, close enough that pedestrians on the street began looking up, shielding their eyes, murmuring questions to strangers standing beside them. Sirens joined the chorus next. Not the 2 lonely patrol cars that had started this entire episode, but a convoy that seemed to stretch the length of the block. Black sport utility vehicles moving in disciplined formation, headlights flashing in unison, the kind of procession usually reserved for visiting heads of state or the aftermath of a terrorist threat. Crow turned first, more out of professional curiosity than concern, assuming, perhaps, that federal agents were arriving to assist with what he still believed was a straightforward stolen vehicle case. His confidence lasted exactly as long as it took the lead vehicles to brake sharply along the curb and disgorge more than 20 agents in tactical gear, moving with the kind of coordinated urgency that suggested this was no routine assist. Officers who had been laughing moments earlier fell silent. Pedestrians pressed back against storefronts to make room. A hostage rescue unit fanned out along the perimeter of the block, sealing off both ends of the street with a speed that left local patrol officers standing awkwardly in the middle of a scene that had, in the span of moments, become entirely federal. Nobody moved towards Serena at first. Every uniform on that street assumed the woman standing quietly near the destroyed Rolls-Royce was simply another bystander, perhaps the victim of whatever crime the arriving agents had come to investigate. Some of the local officers straightened instinctively, smoothing their uniforms, preparing themselves to explain a routine tow operation to whatever federal task force had apparently deemed it important enough to warrant this level of response. Crow actually took a step toward the lead vehicle, ready to offer an account of events that still cast himself in a reasonable light, still confident that whatever had gone wrong here was a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with the right explanation delivered to the right person. It took a senior agent, silver-haired, unmistakably in command, stepping out of the lead vehicle and walking directly past Crow without acknowledgement to shatter that assumption completely. The agent crossed the street with purpose, stopped in front of Serena, and snapped to attention with a formal salute that seemed almost out of place on a public sidewalk lined with confused onlookers. "Good afternoon, Director Hale," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent block. "We received your signal. The perimeter is secure." For a long moment, nobody on that street made a sound. Rylan Crow felt the blood drain from his face so completely that a nearby officer would later describe him as looking like a man who had seen a ghost walk directly through him. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and looked from the senior agent to Serena and back again, as though hoping the words might rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic. "Director," he repeated, barely above a whisper. Serena turned to face him fully for the first time since the confrontation began. Her expression was unreadable, neither triumphant nor cruel, simply calm in the way that unsettled people, far more than anger, ever could. "Yes, Lieutenant," she said, "Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the same woman you accused of stealing her own car earlier." A junior officer near the tow truck dropped his notepad. The sound of it hitting the pavement seemed unnaturally loud in the silence that followed. The man who had been filming from across the street lowered his phone slightly, still recording, unwilling to miss a single second of what was unfolding. Serena did not raise her voice. She did not gloat. She did not demand an apology, though every person on that block understood one was owed several times over. She simply turned to the agent who had greeted her and asked a single question in the same measured tone she had used throughout the entire ordeal. "Has the scene been documented?" she asked. "Fully, ma'am," he replied. "Body cam footage is already being pulled from every unit present. Nothing leaves this street until it's catalogued." Serena nodded once. "Good," she said. "I want this handled by the book, every step of it." Crow took a half step forward, perhaps intending to explain himself, perhaps simply reacting instinctively to the collapse of everything he had assumed about the encounter. Serena held up a hand, not sharply, but with enough quiet authority that he stopped immediately. "Not now," she said. "You will have every opportunity to explain your actions to people whose job it is to evaluate them." Within a short time, a member of Serena's staff arrived with a folder that contained a preliminary damage assessment. Photographs already taken from every angle of the ruined Phantom, its shattered glass, its broken bumper, its buckled wheel, its gouged and scraped body panels catching the gray afternoon light in ways that made the destruction look almost sculptural. Serena flipped through the images slowly, her expression giving nothing away, though anyone watching closely might have noticed the faint tightening around her eyes. When she reached the photograph of the driver's seat covered in shattered glass, she paused. "I want a full accounting of every dollar this will cost to repair," she told her aide. "And then I want that number set aside entirely, because it is not the point of this investigation." The aide asked what the point was, if not the cost of the vehicle itself. "The point," Serena said, closing the folder, "is that 4 officers assumed a stolen vehicle before checking a single record, escalated to destruction of property without any legal basis, denied a citizen due process for a prolonged period, and made their reasoning for that assumption embarrassingly clear in front of a street full of witnesses." She did not need to say the word aloud. Everyone standing near her understood exactly what she meant by reasoning. Over the following days, investigators from the Bureau's internal division worked alongside the district's police oversight board to pull every piece of evidence connected to the incident. Body cam footage was requested from all 4 responding officers. Dispatch logs were pulled to determine who had authorized the tow order and under what justification. Vehicle identification records were checked, revealing, unsurprisingly to everyone except the officers involved, that the Phantom had never appeared on any stolen vehicle registry. Not in Maryland, not in Virginia, not anywhere in the country. 3 of the 4 body cams produced complete, unbroken footage. The 4th, belonging to Lieutenant Rylan Crow, showed a significant gap precisely during the period when the most damaging remarks had allegedly been made. Investigators noted the timing of the gap with particular interest, since department policy required officers to keep their equipment running continuously during any active field encounter, and any interruption longer than a few seconds was supposed to trigger an automatic flag within the system. The fact that Crow's device had failed for exactly the period covering the most consequential exchange raised questions that Internal Affairs pursued with unusual persistence. A forensic technician examining the device found no evidence of mechanical failure, no dropped connection, nothing that would explain the gap as anything other than a manual interruption. The technician's report used careful, understated language, noting only that the interruption appeared inconsistent with standard equipment behavior. But everyone who read the report understood exactly what that sentence was suggesting without stating it outright. Serena, briefed on the technical findings by her chief of staff, said little in response beyond asking that the forensic report be preserved in full and shared with the Department of Justice alongside everything else. She had seen enough investigations over the course of her career to know that a missing interval too rarely stayed missing. Once enough people started asking the right questions in the right order. The gap in Crow's footage might have ended the investigation quietly, buried under procedural excuses about malfunctioning equipment, had it not been for the recording captured independently by the bystander across the street, the one who had never lowered his phone through the entire encounter. When investigators reviewed his footage alongside the other 3 officers' body cams, they were able to reconstruct almost the entire missing window, including audio clear enough to remove any doubt about what had been said. "A woman like her doesn't own a car like that," one voice said clearly on the recording. Forensic audio analysts confirmed within days that the voice belonged to Crow. The line, once isolated and verified, became the single piece of evidence around which the entire case would eventually turn. It appeared in the Internal Affairs Report. It appeared in the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Review. It appeared, eventually, in local news coverage once portions of the investigation became public record, though Serena's office made certain that release happened only after the formal process had run its full course, never rushed, never leaked for effect. Rylan Crow was placed on administrative leave within a short time, pending the outcome of both an internal disciplinary review and a separate criminal inquiry into the unauthorized search of Serena's vehicle. 2 of the other officers present, including the young man who had made the initial remark about nobody around here owning a car like that outright, were reassigned pending investigation. The tow truck driver, who had proceeded with an operation that any reasonable person would have paused to question, faced scrutiny of his own for failing to verify authorization before beginning the tow. The district's Police Oversight Board opened a broader inquiry into towing procedures across the department, prompted directly by the discovery that officers had ordered a vehicle destroyed without confirming ownership, without a warrant, and without any documented probable cause beyond assumptions made based on nothing more than the woman standing beside the car. As the inquiry expanded, investigators uncovered a pattern that troubled even seasoned oversight officials who had reviewed hundreds of complaints over the years. Records showed that Crow's unit had ordered an unusually high number of vehicle tows over the preceding period, and a disproportionate share of those tows involved luxury vehicles owned by drivers from minority backgrounds, many of which were later released without charges once ownership was properly verified, often after hours of delay, and in several cases after damage had already occurred during the tow itself. None of the earlier incidents had drawn the kind of attention Serena's case commanded, largely because none of the earlier drivers had access to the resources or standing required to force a full accounting. Oversight officials flagged the pattern as evidence of a systemic issue rather than an isolated lapse in judgment, a distinction that would matter greatly once the department began negotiating the terms of its eventual reform agreement. Time passed before the investigation reached its conclusion, time in which Serena continued her work at the Bureau exactly as she had before. Briefings, threat assessments, congressional testimony, the daily machinery of national security that did not pause simply because her own case had become a matter of public interest. She declined every interview request. She issued no public statement beyond a brief acknowledgement that the incident was under review and that she trusted the process to reach a fair conclusion. Privately, colleagues who worked closest to her noticed something different in the period following the incident. Not anger, not bitterness, but a quiet resolve that seemed to sharpen everything she did. She sat in on portions of the Internal Affairs Review herself, not to influence the outcome, but to understand precisely how a system meant to protect citizens had so completely failed to protect her, and by extension, anyone without her particular set of circumstances standing between them and a similar afternoon. When the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division finalized its findings, the report was unambiguous. There had been no probable cause for the initial tow. There had been no warrant for the search that followed. There was clear evidence that assumptions about Serena's identity, rooted in nothing but her appearance, had directly influenced the officer's decision to escalate rather than verify. The report used careful, clinical language, but the conclusion was plain enough for anyone to understand. Rylan Crowe was terminated from the department. 2 other officers received suspensions without pay and mandatory retraining. The department itself entered into a consent agreement requiring updated policies on vehicle towing verification, updated protocols for search authorization, and a new civilian oversight mechanism specifically designed to review complaints involving allegations of bias in policing decisions. Serena read the final report twice before setting it down on her desk. She did not celebrate. She thought instead of every citizen who had lived through some smaller, less documented version of that afternoon and never received a report with her name on it. Never had a Department of Justice division dedicate careful review to their particular grievance. Never watched the officer who wronged them lose so much as a single day of pay. She thought about how much of the outcome depended not on the strength of her case, but on the resources available to pursue it. Resources most people would never have. That imbalance sat with her longer than any anger toward Crowe ever could. She simply picked up her phone and asked her scheduling office to arrange a press availability. The room was packed well before Serena entered it. Reporters from every major outlet in the country crowded shoulder to shoulder along the back wall once the seats filled. Cameras mounted on tripods stretched in a long row facing the podium. Speculation had swirled for some time about what the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation might say about an incident that had, despite her office's efforts to keep details measured and procedural, become one of the most discussed stories in the country. Serena walked to the podium wearing the same understated composure she carried into every room, whether briefing the president or standing on a sidewalk watching her car get torn apart. She did not reference the make or model of the vehicle. She did not mention the specific dollar figure attached to the damage. She did not name Rylan Crowe, though everyone in the room already knew exactly who she meant. The law does not exist to protect those who already hold power, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room without need for emphasis or theater. It exists to protect every citizen from the misuse of that power, regardless of what badge, uniform, or title happens to be standing behind it. What happened to me on that street could happen to anyone. The only difference in my case is that I had the ability to demand accountability. Most people do not. She spoke for several more minutes, outlining the policy changes that had already been implemented, the oversight mechanisms being built into departments across multiple jurisdictions, the training programs being developed to address exactly the kind of assumption-based escalation that had turned a routine afternoon into a public spectacle. She described a new national framework her office had helped draft in cooperation with municipal police departments, one that required officers to verify ownership through at least 2 independent databases before authorizing the tow of any vehicle valued above a certain threshold, and one that mandated an automatic supervisory review anytime a citizen challenged an officer's determination on the spot. She spoke about funding being redirected toward bias awareness training that went beyond a single afternoon seminar, toward programs designed to be revisited and reinforced throughout an officer's career rather than treated as a box checked once and forgotten. A reporter near the front row asked whether she felt any anger toward Rylan Crowe personally, whether some part of her wanted to see him face harsher consequences than termination. Serena paused before answering, the first true pause of the entire briefing. "Anger is easy," she said finally. "Anger would have felt justified in the moment, and it still might if I allowed myself the space to feel it fully. But anger does not fix a broken verification process. It does not prevent the next officer from making the same assumption about the next citizen. What fixes those things is unglamorous, patient work, the kind that rarely makes headlines, but changes what happens on a street corner long after everyone has stopped talking about my particular afternoon. She took no further questions about her personal feelings. She deflected every subsequent attempt to turn the moment into a story about her individually, redirecting each answer back toward the systemic changes she intended to see through to completion. The speech spread quickly once clips began circulating, replayed on news broadcasts throughout the evening, discussed in editorial pages the following morning, cited in policy discussions into councils and police departments in cities that had nothing to do with the original incident. Within a short period, 3 separate states had opened reviews of their own towing verification procedures, citing Serena's case directly as the catalyst. The phantom itself underwent a different kind of process entirely. Rather than sell the wreckage or quietly repair it out of public view, Serena authorized its restoration through the same craftsmen who had built it originally, insisting that every repair be documented alongside the damage report already filed as evidence. The car became, in its own quiet way, a physical record of everything that had happened, a reminder built into steel and leather and hand-rubbed paint that the truth of that afternoon could not simply be buffed away and forgotten. Later, once the repairs were complete, once the final panel had been refinished and the last piece of glass replaced, Serena drove the restored Phantom down the same stretch of street where it had once been dragged sideways across the pavement. The coffee shop was still there, its windows fogged faintly from the afternoon crowd inside. The corner where the tow truck had once idled now sat empty, unremarkable, indistinguishable from any other block in the city to anyone who had not lived through what happened there. A pair of newly assigned officers stood near the intersection, part of a rotation that had changed considerably since the incident, part of a department working to rebuild trust one small decision at a time. As the restored Rolls-Royce passed, gleaming obsidian black beneath a clearing autumn sky, both officers straightened and offered a formal, respectful nod, an acknowledgement that needed no words attached to it. Serena did not slow down. She did not look back at the spot where her car had once been torn apart in front of a crowd of strangers who assumed the worst about her simply because of how she looked. She allowed herself only the faintest smile, the kind that carried no bitterness in it, only quiet certainty, before continuing forward down the street and disappearing into the flow of traffic ahead. Later that evening, alone in her study with the day's briefings finally cleared from her desk, Serena allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She thought about the version of that afternoon that might have unfolded had she been anyone else. A young mother running errands, a retired teacher out for a drive, a college student borrowing a relative's car for the weekend. She thought about how many of those people would have had no brief phone call capable of summoning 3 helicopters and 20 agents. No title carved into a brass nameplate to force a room full of officers into sudden, humbled silence. The thought did not leave her satisfied. It left her certain that the work was nowhere near finished, that the policy changes already underway were only the first layer of a problem that ran far deeper than one lieutenant and one afternoon on one street corner. She kept a single photograph from that day in her desk drawer. Not the images of the shattered glass or the broken bumper that had circulated through the investigative file, but a still frame pulled from the bystander's recording. The moment just before the agent's salute, when the entire street stood frozen in collective disbelief. She looked at it sometimes, not for the vindication it offered, but as a reminder of exactly how thin the line had been between being heard and being ignored, and how many people on the other side of that line never got the chance she had gotten to make the world listen. Time passed, and the reforms Serena had championed began showing measurable results across the jurisdictions that adopted them. Complaint numbers involving vehicle seizures dropped sharply in the districts that implemented the new verification standards. A handful of officers in departments far from Washington later credited the policy changes, indirectly at least, with preventing situations that might otherwise have escalated the way hers had. Serena read those reports quietly, without fanfare, filing each one away as evidence that the unglamorous work she had insisted upon was doing exactly what she had hoped it would do. She never spoke publicly about Rylan Crowe again after the press conference, declining every follow-up request for a statement on his termination, his subsequent legal troubles, or the civil suit he attempted and ultimately abandoned against the department that had let him go. She had said what needed saying in that room full of reporters, and she saw no value in revisiting it simply to satisfy curiosity that had little to do with the actual work of preventing the next injustice. When colleagues occasionally brought up the incident in passing, she answered briefly and moved the conversation forward, treating that afternoon as one data point among many other than the defining moment of her career, even though everyone around her understood it had, in its own quiet way, become exactly that. Power, in the end, was never proven by a title stitched onto a jacket or a name printed on an office door. It was proven in the choice made in the moment when someone with every reason to demand punishment instead demanded something far more difficult and far more lasting. A system that would treat the person standing on that sidewalk, whoever they were, with the fairness that should never have depended on rank to begin with.